The G7 summit up in Charlevoix, Quebec, was supposed to be just another routine meeting until things took a dramatic turn. What started as a standard gathering quickly turned into a pivotal moment for the relationship between the United States and Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, calm but determined, stepped up to the global stage with a message for the world. He talked about the strong bond between Canada and America, but made it clear Canada wasn't about to be pushed around. Trudeau called out the new US tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum as insulting, promising that Canada wouldn't just roll over. President Trump, flying high on Air Force One, fired back with a barrage of tweets, calling Trudeau very dishonest and weak. Canadians were taken aback by the personal nature of Trump's attack, realizing the relationship had hit a new low. Diplomatic niceties were tossed aside, replaced by open confrontation. The world watched closely as two long-time allies squared off in front of everyone. This wasn't just a war of words, it was a clash of two very different worldviews. For Canada, it was about standing up for fair trade and the rules that have kept things steady for decades. For Trump and his team, it was all about America first, even if that meant shaking up old friendships. The Charlevoix summit became a symbol of this new, unpredictable chapter. The post-war alliance was feeling the strain, and Canada suddenly found itself right on the front lines. What began as a trade dispute now looked and felt like a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Canadians, used to a steady relationship with their neighbour to the south, were forced to pay attention. Seeing their Prime Minister publicly called out by a US President was a jolt to the Canadian public. The G7 in Charlevoix was the wake-up call. Canada had to get ready for a much tougher relationship with America. A line had been drawn, bold, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. The conflict didn't start at the G7. It had been brewing for months over trade. The central issue, NAFTA. President Trump called it the worst trade deal ever made and demanded a complete overhaul. Canadian officials argued NAFTA benefited all three countries, pointing to decades of economic growth. Negotiations were tense and uncertain. Then, the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. To Canadians, this was baffling. How could a close ally be a security threat? The tariffs felt like a betrayal, a pressure tactic in the NAFTA talks. Other disputes flared: softwood lumber, dairy and supply management. Each added complexity and frustration. At the heart was a clash of philosophies. Canada favoured multilateral rules-based trade. The US took a transactional zero-sum approach. Finding common ground became nearly impossible. The conflict wasn't just about steel or milk. It was about the principles that had governed North American trade for a generation. The future of the economic relationship was at stake. The stakes were high for both countries. The battle lines were drawn. The world watched as the old order was challenged. Canada's response was measured but firm. Trudeau and Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland emphasised Canada would not be intimidated, defending Canadian interests without resorting to personal attacks. Their message: Canada is the reasonable, stable partner. Across the country, Canadians reacted with shock and defiance. Insults against the Prime Minister were seen as attacks on the nation. A wave of patriotism swept the country. Buy Canadian trended and people boycotted American goods. This grassroots movement gave the government a strong mandate to stand firm. Political parties, usually divided, united behind the government's stance. The message defending Canada transcends politics. Business leaders and industry groups warned of economic damage on both sides of the border. They highlighted how deeply integrated the two economies are. Canadian groups lobbied in Washington, explaining how tariffs would hurt Americans too. The response was multi-front diplomacy, public sentiment, and business advocacy. Canada's reaction was deep and widespread. The country stood united in the face of unprecedented pressure. The world took notice. Canada didn't just talk, it acted. In response to US tariffs, Canada announced its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods. The targets were strategic products from key US states and districts. The goals show Canada would defend its interests and create political pressure in the US. Canada also launched legal challenges at the WTO and under NAFTA rules. reinforcing its commitment to a rules-based order. The government invested in diversifying trade, strengthening ties with Europe and Asia. Deals like the CPTPP and CETA became priorities. The message Canada would not be held hostage by one market. These actions made the Canadian economy more resilient. Canada was determined to fight back on every front. The era of quiet compliance was over. Canada had found its resolve. The mood in Canada was a complex mix of anger, pride and anxiety. Many felt betrayed by the US, a country they'd long seen as a friend. The suggestion that Canada was a security threat stung deeply. Anger was directed at the Trump administration, not the American people. At the same time, national pride surged. Canadians rallied behind their leaders, proud to see them stand firm. The #Buy Canadian movement and support for retaliatory measures reflected this pride, but beneath it all was anxiety. The US is Canada's largest trading partner. A trade war threatened jobs and economic stability. People worried about rising costs and lost markets. Business owners feared for their future. The daily news was dominated by the dispute, creating a sense of instability. The comfortable, predictable relationship was gone. Canadians were forced to confront tough questions about their identity and economic future. A new reality had set in. Facing an unpredictable US, Canada turned outward. Trudeau and his cabinet engaged in global diplomacy, building coalitions against protectionism. Major speeches like Chrystia Freeland's address in New York outlined Canada's commitment to a rules-based order. Canada positioned itself as a reliable partner in uncertain times. Alliances with the G7, G20 and NATO were strengthened. Canada found common cause with countries also facing US tariffs. The message, we are stronger together. Behind the scenes, Canadian diplomats lobbied US governors, Congress members and business leaders. They bypassed the White House, appealing directly to American interests. Armed with data, they showed how many US jobs depended on trade with Canada. This Team Canada approach was targeted and effective. Canada's diplomatic campaign was sophisticated and relentless. The world saw Canada stepping up. The contrast in communication styles was stark. The White House was aggressive and unpredictable, with President Trump using Twitter to escalate tensions. Trade was framed as a battle, and personal insults were common. Canada's tone was calm and consistent, focused on facts and principles. Officials avoided personal attacks, framing tariffs as regrettable but necessary. The goal appear as the steady hand in a turbulent relationship. Engaging in a war of words was seen as futile. Canada's strategy was to highlight its reasonableness and reliability. Media coverage reflected these differences. Drama in the US, measured analysis in Canada. In the US, the story was about fighting for American workers. In Canada, it was about defending sovereignty and stability. The world saw two very different approaches to crisis. Canada's decision to stand up to the Trump administration was a defining moment. It was about defending economic interests and setting a precedent against protectionism. Retaliatory tariffs signaled Canada would not be a passive victim. It was also about national identity. Canada as an independent nation, not just America's junior partner. Public support showed a deep desire for self-assertion. The experience forced Canada to rethink its reliance on the US market. Diversifying trade became a long-term strategy. Future governments will be more cautious in dealing with Washington. The era of taking the relationship for granted is over. Canada's confrontation was a lesson in resilience and strategic diplomacy. It showed a middle power can stand up to a superpower. The path ahead will be challenging, but Canada has asserted its place on the world stage. Standing firm is now part of Canada's identity and future.